There is no single pattern of abuse. Sometimes abuse is a continuation of long-standing patterns of physical, emotional, or financial abuse within the family. Abuse can be related to changes in living situations and relationships brought about by either the older or vulnerable person's growing dependence on others for companionship and for meeting basic needs, or by a family member's increased reliance on the older or vulnerable person for shelter and financial support. It's not unusual for our investigations to have more than one type of allegation for the same person. The types of vulnerable adult abuse defined by Nevada Revised Statute, NRS 200.5092, include abandonment, abuse, neglect, exploitation, isolation, and self-neglect. Abandonment is the desertion of an older person or a vulnerable person in an unsafe manner by a caregiver or other person with a legal duty of care. Abandonment also includes the withdrawal of necessary assistance owed to the older person or a vulnerable person by a caregiver or other person with an obligation to provide services to the older person or vulnerable adult. When a vulnerable adult is in the hospital or any other type of care facility, it is not considered abandonment if the family or caregiver is unable to provide the necessary care and they will not agree to have the vulnerable adult discharged back home. Leaving a vulnerable adult who requires some type of assistance to be safe alone and unattended would be considered abandonment. A caregiver could be family, friends, paid professional caregivers, care providers in a nursing home, group home, or assisted living facility. Individuals who take on the role as caregiver, regardless of being paid or not, have a legal duty to ensure the vulnerable adult's safety. Abuse as defined by Nevada law is the willful infliction of pain or injury on an older person or a vulnerable person, the deprivation of food, shelter, clothing, or services which are necessary to maintain physical or mental health. The infliction of psychological or emotional anguish, pain or distress, or non-consensual sexual contact with an older person or a vulnerable person. 3 types of abuse are physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Physical abuse can range from slapping or shoving to severe beatings and restrainings with ropes or other types of restraints. When a family member, caregiver, or other person uses force to cause unnecessary pain or injury, the behavior can be regarded as abusive. Physical abuse can include hitting, pushing, kicking, burning, and sexual abuse. It also includes the inappropriate use of medications and physical restraints. Case sample. APS investigated a report of concern regarding an 80-year-old woman. The report indicated that the woman's lips had a yellow discoloration like the end of a healing bruise. It was reported that the woman lived with her spouse and they were married for 25 years. The report of concern was that her husband hit her and caused the bruise on her lips. The husband did not allow the woman to speak to anyone without him being present, and the woman was very frail and only weighed 59 pounds. There was also concern that he may not be letting her eat. When she was taken out to eat, she ate as though she was starving. 2 social workers made contact with the woman at her home, and her husband was present. 1 social worker took the husband into a separate room to speak with him so that the other social worker could speak with the woman privately. The woman indicated that in the past, sometimes her husband had gotten angry with her and blamed her for things that she did not do. The woman repeatedly said she did not want to cause problems for herself and did not want to discuss domestic violence, verbal or physical abuse. The social worker assured the woman that the information would not be discussed with the husband, and the social worker wanted to keep the woman safe. The social worker informed the woman that domestic violence was illegal, and they discussed options for her safety. The woman reported that she knew she could call 911 for assistance, and she stated, "I have to be careful about my answers because I may get hit." The woman did not want to leave her situation at that time and repeatedly indicated to the social worker that the issue could not be addressed with her husband or she would get into trouble. The client was provided verbal information regarding domestic violence, and options were identified for a safety plan. She also knew she could contact her children if she needed assistance. A victim advocate with the police department was aware of the reported abuse as well, in case the woman wanted to seek assistance at a later time. Eventually, this woman needed more care than her spouse could provide, and she was admitted to a group home. Her husband was allowed to have supervised visits with her, and she remained safe, had plenty of food, and the care that she needed. Psychological abuse can range from name-calling to intimidating and threatening the vulnerable adult. When a family member, a caregiver, or another person behaves in a way that causes fear, emotional pain, or distress, the behavior can be regarded as abusive. Psychological abuse can include yelling, swearing, and making insulting, disrespectful, or threatening comments. APS receives a number of reports where the vulnerable adult is threatened to be taken out of the home if they don't do something they are asked to do, such as taking their medications or taking a shower. Case sample. APS investigated a report and found that a woman's husband was being aggressive, confrontational, and hostile, and using foul language towards her. He attempted to throw his walker at her, spit at her, and put his fists up, threatening to hit her. Psychological abuse was substantiated in this case. This behavior from the husband caused severe emotional anguish for the client due to the continual verbal assaults and the fear of potential physical abuse. Sexual abuse is defined by Nevada law as non-consensual sexual contact, an act that the older person or vulnerable person is unable to understand or is unable to communicate his or her objection. This includes when the vulnerable adult is forced, tricked, coerced, or manipulated into any unwanted sexual contact. Anytime sexual abuse is alleged, law enforcement must be contacted immediately. A report to APS should also be made. APS social workers will work with the vulnerable adult to develop a case plan to ensure the vulnerable adult's safety and well-being. Case sample. APS investigated a case of a 72-year-old female who resided in a skilled nursing facility. The woman resided in a facility setting due to memory deficits and inability to independently meet her own care needs. While the woman was verbal, she had difficulty communicating clearly due to her impairments. The woman's ex-husband scheduled to take the client out of the facility for weekly outings to church and out for a meal. The ex-husband was frequently late in returning her to the facility, and the woman began exhibiting signs of distress and anxiety following her return from her outings back to the facility. An APS social worker met with the woman as well as the facility staff during the investigation, and it was determined by carefully interviewing the woman and obtaining additional information from the facility staff and medical personnel that the woman was being sexually assaulted during her outings with her ex-husband. Law enforcement was contacted immediately. The social worker also worked closely with facility staff to prevent the woman from outings with the ex-husband and assisted the woman to obtain a guardian to manage her future care needs. Neglect is the failure of a person or a manager of a facility who has assumed legal responsibility or contractual obligation for caring for a vulnerable adult, or who has voluntarily assumed responsibility to provide services that are necessary to maintain the physical or mental health needs of the vulnerable adult. Neglect includes the failure to provide food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and assistance with activities of daily living. Neglect does not have to be intentional. Family caregivers may inadvertently neglect because of their own lack of knowledge or resources. When thinking about neglect, it's helpful to keep in mind that assuming responsibility for a vulnerable adult's care does not necessarily mean that there is a contractual agreement or any type of legal authority. It could be anyone who has voluntarily assumed the responsibility for the vulnerable adult's care, such as a family member, neighbor, or friend. If a person establishes a pattern of providing necessary care to a vulnerable adult and then later determines they no longer want to or cannot continue to provide care, they have an obligation to ensure the vulnerable adult's needs are met. Case sample. APS worked with a 79-year-old female client who was wheelchair bound and resided in a rental home with her adult daughter. The client was dependent upon the daughter to meet the majority of her care needs, and the daughter expressed she was the primary care provider. However, the client routinely was observed as being unbathed with soiled clothing. There were multiple pets, and there was feces and urine throughout the home. The client also had unmet medical needs. During the investigation, the daughter admitted she was overwhelmed by her mother's care needs and had become depressed, causing her to neglect her mother's care. The APS social worker met with the client and assessed her care needs. The social worker also met with the client's daughter to understand the daughter's limitations in meeting her mom's care needs and assess the factors that contributed to her inability to take care of her mother adequately. The social worker worked closely with the client to identify her preference to live in another setting that best met her care needs. The social worker then helped to coordinate a transition to a new environment where her care needs could be addressed and she could elect to visit her daughter. During periods of extreme heat or cold, vulnerable adults may require assistance in determining an appropriate level of exposure to harsh weather conditions, and extra precautions must be taken when considering the needs of vulnerable adults. The vulnerable adult's body may limit their ability to regulate weather sufficiently, and seniors may not be able to verbalize their level of comfort related to the temperature extremes. Caregivers and responsible parties must consider the following to ensure the safety and well-being of the vulnerable adult. Supervision is provided to vulnerable adults when they are outdoors. Comfortable indoor and outdoor temperatures are considered. Whether appropriate clothing is worn at all times, and cognitive ability and mobility considerations. Self-neglect is the failure of a vulnerable adult to provide for his or her own needs because of an inability to do so. Although the definition sounds simple, the issues related to self-neglect are often complex. Self-neglect could be a result of unexpressed rage, frustration, or grief, alcoholism or drug addiction, and sacrificing for children, grandchildren, or others at the expense of their own unmet needs. Mental or physical illness can quickly result in the deterioration of a vulnerable adult's ability to adequately provide for their own needs. APS may go in and assist the individual with resources such as arranging for personal care services, or may need to arrange for further evaluation by a mental health clinician to determine the vulnerable adult's ability to make decisions regarding their own care. Interventions are intended to enable the vulnerable adult to remain as independent as possible. However, when a vulnerable adult refuses and it is determined they are at significant risk of harm, APS may make a referral to the Public Guardian's Office for consideration of guardianship. It's important to keep in mind that only a judge can make the final determination if guardianship is appropriate. It's also important to remember that ADSD does not have the authority to remove a vulnerable adult from bad situations. APS may contact local law enforcement or emergency responders for situations needing immediate intervention, or when a vulnerable adult is in danger to themselves or other. Case sample. APS received a report from a police department regarding a woman who had wandered into her neighbor's backyard. Police found that she was confused and had locked herself out of her home, where they assisted her to gain access. The police reported she was extremely sunburned, dehydrated, and had defecated on herself. During the investigation, the social worker found that there were boxes stacking along the walls with no clear paths, a strong urine odor, and her toilet and sink were full of used briefs. There was also a stack of unopened bills on the counter. Due to the woman's confusion, APS arranged for the individual to be evaluated by her primary care physician for capacity. The physician determined she was in need of guardianship. A referral was made to the public guardian's office, and the guardian was able to find a group home that could meet the care needs of the woman and ensure her well-being. Self-determination is where a competent person has a right to make his or her own decisions, good or bad, whether we agree with their choices or not. The right to self-determination is often the most challenging concept for many people to understand. If the vulnerable adult chooses to remain in an abusive situation, drink too much, live in a hoarding environment, or not see their doctor unless they are deemed incompetent, they have the right to self-determination. Although the services we attempt are designed to be the least restrictive, and meant to assist the vulnerable adult, persons who are competent ultimately have the right to refuse services. Refusal of services can be very frustrating for professionals, families, and communities as a whole. Financial exploitation is a violation of a relationship based on trust and confidence. This includes the improper use of legal guardianship arrangements and power of attorney. Exploitation may range from misuse of vulnerable adults' funds to embezzlement. Financial exploitation includes fraud, taking money, assets, or property through deception, intimidation, or undue influence. This may include forgery, forced property transfers, purchasing items with the vulnerable adult's money without that person's knowledge or permission, denying the vulnerable adult access to his or her own funds, or home with the intention of permanently depriving the vulnerable adult. Undue influence means the improper use of power or trust in a way that deprives a person of his or her free will and substitutes the objectives of another person. Case sample. A couple befriended an 86-year-old man who suffered from dementia and exploited him. The senior worked all his life and diligently saved his money. He met the couple who was living next door to him. The couple moved into his home, ended up selling his home, and then rented a home using his money. The couple took the senior to an attorney to change his power of attorney from his niece to themselves. The power of attorney was changed, but the senior lacked capacity when it was changed, therefore the power of attorney was invalid. During a 6-month period, the couple spent $100,000 on the senior's money. $15,500 was spent on items from a home shopping network. $15,000 was spent on a local casino, and $60,000 was used on a credit card. The couple also used the man's resources to pay for dental work and to purchase a $25,000 car. The couple pled guilty to felony exploitation of the vulnerable adult. They were sentenced to 5 years in Nevada State Prison and ordered to pay restitution to the man's estate. Isolation is preventing a vulnerable adult from having contact with another person by physically restraining and or intentionally preventing the vulnerable adult from receiving visitors, mails, or phone call. Restraining a vulnerable adult to prevent visitation is criminal when done without justification, such as to protect the property, physical, and mental welfare of the vulnerable adult pursuant to the instructions of a physician. Isolation also includes when a person knowingly provides a false statement contrary to the express wishes of the person with the intent to prevent visitors and callers. Case sample. APS received a report of concern regarding a vulnerable adult who was living with his son. His daughter, who resides out of state, was concerned because she wasn't able to talk with her father and felt her brother was keeping her father away from the phone and wouldn't allow them to talk. A social worker went out to the home and spoke to the vulnerable adult, who informed the social worker it was his choice not to speak to his daughter and say that his son wasn't doing anything wrong. Isolation was unsubstantiated in this case because the vulnerable adult did not want to speak with his daughter. There are occasions where physically restraining a person is necessary, and you may see this in a hospital setting. If it is appropriate, the person must have a physician's order.